Come with me for our tour of the Jewish Museum. We're even going to have an interview with Marvin Pinkert. Marvin is a noted historian here in the Baltimore area, or the Jewish Historical Museum. It's on the corner of Lloyd Street and Lombard. Lombard was once the center of the Jewish community. And just look at the beautiful architecture. Hard to believe at one time they had thought about destroying some of these temples here. You're looking at the center of the Jewish Historical Museum here in the greater Baltimore area. It gives you many opportunities to explore Jewish history. There's one main exhibit area that summarizes the Jewish experience in Baltimore. There are also traveling exhibits. There's now an exhibit on Harry Houdini, the great Jewish magician. Now, one thing when you come to this museum, the best part,
the history of the building and all of its guises. And then we go downstairs to a really wonderful exhibit we've created called Synagogue Speaks.
Now you're looking at the courtyard of the Jewish Museum. Hours are Sunday through Thursday, 10 to 5. They have guided tours. At about 4 p.m. I may have lucked out. This exhibit is called Welcome to the Neighborhood. It's kind of like Lombard Street at the turn of the century. It became a predominantly Jewish neighborhood. It tells the story of Jewish roots in Baltimore. I'm trying to take you to what a small tenement living room would have looked like at the turn of the century. And they actually make you feel like you're on the historic Lombard Street. The combination of photographs with three-dimensional objects, like look at those fake tomatoes and produce. And you see some fake chickens too. Anyway, it makes you feel like you're walking down the street. Imagine at the turn of the century getting a big corned beef sandwich for 25 cents. Very interesting. Altman's is the big local deli here. It still survives. There's special exhibits too. There's also a multi-purpose room for lectures and special social events. It also has a nice gift shop too. Hey, let's look at the Synagogue Speaks exhibit in the historic synagogue. Hey, today we're at the Lloyd Street Synagogue, part of the Jewish Museum here in Baltimore, with Marvin Pinkert. Marvin is a noted historian here in the Baltimore area. Today he's going to tell us about the Lloyd Street Synagogue. Marvin, this building is exquisite. With all the Jews moving to Boca, tell me how you were able to keep this temple alive.
Well, actually, this is quite an extraordinary building. It is the third oldest standing synagogue in the United States. The Star of David that you see on the back wall is, to the best of our knowledge, the oldest Star of David still existing on the wall of a Jewish synagogue, since the two older synagogues don't have their original stars. This building has been the Baltimore Hebrew congregation, it's been St. John the Baptist Catholic Church, it's been Shomer Mishmeres HaKodesh Synagogue, and finally in 1959 it became part of the Jewish Historical Society of Maryland. And that was because the city had plans to tear it down and put in a parking lot. And a gentleman by the name of Wilbur Hunter, who ran the Peel Museum, said, "You can't do that. This is one of the 12 most important buildings in Baltimore."
Was Wilbur Jewish?
No.
Really?
But he was mindful of what an important role this building had played in the history of the city. And so he insisted that the city preserve it. And he persuaded the synagogue directors to get together and raise the funds to actually restore the building.
Now, do they have services here still? On special occasions?
Not on a regular basis, but there have been weddings, bar mitzvahs held here. It's mainly used for tours that we do about 4 times a day that come into the synagogue. And we have our docents explain the history of the place. And then we go downstairs to a really wonderful exhibit we've created called Synagogue Speaks, which is about the history of the building and all of its guises.
So take me back to the 1800s when this building was created. I imagine men were on the first level and women were in the upper levels?
And the building has been through so much. If you look at the upper level, you'll see that the pews all face forward. That was something the Catholic Church did that was never undone when they restored the building. So actually all the pews on the upper level would have faced inward during the period of the 1840s. Also, the building is somewhat larger than it was in the 1840s.
So there was an expansion.
Yes, if you look at the second pillar, you'll find there's a seam above the pillar. That's where the wall originally stood, and the wall was moved back, complete with the Star of David, in 1860, because the Baltimore Jewish community expanded so much between the 1840s and 1860 that they needed to grow the synagogue. This is also the synagogue that hired the first ordained rabbi in America, Rabbi Abraham Rice, who was hired in 1843, 2 years before the building opened, and came here expecting to become chief rabbi of the United States, and was severely disappointed to learn that, first of all, there wasn't much of a market for a chief rabbi of the United States, and secondly, that the congregants were somewhat lax in their religious practice. And so he went out to a funeral and found that they were performing Masonic rituals at a Jewish funeral. And he said, "This will never do." And the third of the congregation that wanted to perform Masonic rituals, they went out and formed the first Reformed congregation in Baltimore. So in the end, about 7 congregations have formed as dissidents to this original congregation that was here in the 1840s.
Very interesting.
So you'll notice
Marvin's going to talk about a mystery now.
Okay. You notice that that windowsill doesn't align with the other windowsills, that it's tilted.
Yeah, it's crooked.
Yeah, so we were, about 8 years ago, my predecessor went and tried to investigate what the cause of that might be. And we're going to come up and see the surprising results when we go downstairs. Yes, you can go downstairs. Cutaway that you see is where people climbed into the bell tower.
There was a bell tower here at one
Yes.
time. We're going down the stairs now about the mystery of the windowsill. Oh, there's a big exhibit down here.
Come back this way. We're headed to the Mikveh.
To the uninitiated, what is a mikveh?
A mikveh is a ritual bath used by both men and women that was associated with both religious events and with such as marriages, etc., and also with the woman's menstrual cycle.
Oh, okay. And the logic was to make them more
Clean.
purified? Clean. Okay.
In more than a physical sense. This is a cutaway showing where the original wall was of the building, the 1845 wall. And again, when they restored the building, they uncovered this patch of 1845 wall. So we're beyond the wall of the building, and that's an important fact for understanding what happens next. So this is the mikveh that we were aware of from 1905. This is the Orthodox congregation, Shomer Mishmeres HaKodesh, built this mikveh and the one next door. This was the men's mikveh, and the ladies' mikveh, which has a bath associated with it, is on this side. Originally, there would have been a wall here, and the women would have entered from the exterior of the building. Men would have come through the synagogue, and they would each have their own ritual bath area. A mikveh needs to have 2 sources of water to be kosher. One of those sources is rainwater, so every mikveh has a cistern associated with it.
So rainwater would come through that pipe there?
Yes. And the other pipe would have been for water from another natural source. In our case, we believe that source is Jones Falls. In any case, they went digging around to see what the source of the problem upstairs might be, that it's tilted.
Yeah, it's correct.
And one of the things that they discovered was that there was another mikveh here. Except this mikveh could be dated not to 1905 like this one, but to 1845. Now I've just shown you that the wall is back that way in 1845. So what's this doing out here? Well, it turns out that there were 2 outbuildings in addition to the building of the synagogue. One of them was a school, which is about where you're standing, the schoolhouse, and the other was a mikveh, because they needed, this was a traditional congregation from the outset. I remember I said the rabbi was upset because people weren't following tradition and ritual. So they needed to have a mikveh here, and my predecessor had planned that people would walk over the fully excavated mikveh on a sheet of plexi. Problem is that the Jones Falls is still running. And as soon as they got to this level of the mikveh and excavating it, the water started to flow in. So they very quickly took a picture, sanded it in, and said people will walk over a picture of the partially excavated mikveh. But this gave the final clue. Not only was Jones Falls running, but they also noticed that this mikveh would have needed its own cistern. And that cistern is located approximately here, with the wall of the addition of the synagogue right over it. So what they did was they had filled in the cistern with rocks and built the wall on top. What could go wrong? Well, 170 years of compression will in fact cause the rocks to sag a bit. And when the rocks sagged, the wall on top of it sagged as well. And that's the reason that the windowsill is tilted up above.
So there was like global warming even 100 years ago.
Well, I don't know if I refer to it as global warming. I refer to it as compression.
Compression.
And that solves the mystery of the crooked wall.
This is a real safe. Most people don't know this. You would think when you go to a gym or a mikveh, you would store your valuables, but during Prohibition days, they actually stored alcohol here.
And the city thought about tearing it down. And you can see why they might have made that consideration.
Yeah, that looked like it was unsolvable.
Yes, it did.
And children who come to this exhibit
Yes.
can play with models to learn how to build their own temple. This is a rendering how the synagogue looked in 1845.
And then in 1860, you'll notice that one of the innovations was instead of drapes, which were the common way of decorating the walls of a synagogue, they used tinted windows, yellow glass, to keep the light from invading. And they also, the enclosed pews were a unique feature of the synagogue. They were done by Robert Carey Long Jr., the architect, who was a church architect, and he adopted it from the way that Episcopal churches have enclosed pews. It meant that they didn't have dues, they only had fines. And you could be fined for how close your pew was to the front of the synagogue. You could also be fined for causing a disturbance, $5, which was a whole lot of money. For bringing your children under 5 years into the synagogue, 50 cents each. And for Mr. Koenig, a stranger, for chewing tobacco, $1. Since we hold the spittoons of the synagogue, I suspect it was the fact that Mr. Koenig was a stranger that caused the fine.
Many Jews have immigrated to the United States, and you said at one time this was a German congregation?
That's correct.
So did they speak German? Did they speak Yiddish? Did they speak Hebrew?
They
What were
spoke
services
German.
like?
And the services were in German up until the point that Rabbi Rice decided that German carried the infection of reform. So he decided to start giving some sermons in English. And it may not be clear to us today, but at that time, the radical segment of the community were the people who were just off the boat, coming from the revolutions in Hungary and this is the matzah oven of the second Jewish community that was here, Shomer Mishmeres. It was in operation.
So they used to have to make their own matzah. That's unleavened bread
Right.
that they used to celebrate Passover with.
And it wasn't that there wasn't boxed matzah in 1905 when this oven was in operation. It was that that boxed matzah couldn't be trusted by the community, which was an Orthodox community. So they baked their own, what was called watched matzah or shmur matzah here, and they distributed it to the community.
Urban legend says there are some unusual handles.
To provide handlebars that guaranteed people would bow before opening the ark.
So that's the logic.
Well, I hope you enjoyed your tour of the Jewish Museum of Maryland, and remember to subscribe to the Tidy Island CPA channel.